We have the room till 7:45 or 8, I think. So I think we have it until 8. We can continue till 7:45 or 8, rather. There will be an opportunity to ask questions, but I wanted to ask the panelists if they have any urgent reactions, or responses or questions for the other panelists before we move to a broader discussion. And while they think about that, let me thank the students who were very involved in organizing this, namely Brant Weathers, whom I previously introduced, Pedro Cadenas, and also Abid Khan, who's the videographer, among other things. Are there any questions or comments, reactions from the panelists to one another before we launch a broader discussion? No. Okay. Let me ask one question, and if this doesn't have to be answered now, we'll take others. There's a microphone here. Please come up if you'd have a question to ask. And perhaps this is a question especially for Professor Patnaik, but maybe it also applies to Professor Blackburn and others. I wonder whether there is some danger when dealing with a highly aggregative concept, such as imperialism, of engaging in functionalist explanation. The idea that global deflation is functional for capitalists because it protects the value of money is attractive, but I think one would like to understand more. I mean, it might be attractive, let me put it that way, but from some explanatory point of view, but one would like to understand more about the mechanisms, and I'm sure there's much more that Professor Patnaik can say about that, but we would like to hear it, I think, and perhaps one particular suggestion in this regard might be that it would be useful to ask the question as to whether there are distinctions between different segments of capital or capitals with respect to their interests, and how ask how that plays out. What is the mechanism, or what are the mechanisms by which those different interests are aggregated or not to bring about the particular consequences that he has in mind? I mean, it is one thing, of course, to think about the state as the central committee of the capitalist class, but the capitalist class is various, as we know, and certainly in a multinational global context it's various, so we would like to know more about that, I think. But please do come up if you have any questions, comments, criticisms of any kind. Professor Patnaik, would you like to have some reaction while we wait for any voices?
Well, I'll just put in a word in favor of functional explanation. I don't see there's anything wrong with functional explanation in its as a part of a general understanding of what's going on. For one thing, this is not a bunch of robotic automata that are running the system. I mean, they're people who have their own conception of how it works and what its priorities are, and they have plans. They don't always succeed, but...
Yeah, I would call that a mechanism, which you've just described.
Could I...
Please.
Perhaps come in. I think in adopting a functionalist explanation, one's not really excluding, or one perhaps is not, or not necessarily excluding, that other courses, other conducts, other agreements, other compacts and treaties might be reached. And in a way, I have a question for the fellow panelists, and in particular Prabhat, and it goes like this, that and perhaps also for Anwar, because really we've been tending to use the word imperialism for what are sort of excesses of capitalism, sort of necessary excesses of capitalism. But are they all, I mean, they're functional to capitalism, there's a capitalist logic to them, but would it be possible to imagine that logic being challenged or interrupted? Is there such a thing, or could there be such a thing as anti-imperialism? And could there be such a thing as anti-imperialism short of destroying capitalism entirely in all the world at one blow? So I think in some of his writings, Prabhat has come up with ideas, for example, that surplus generating countries should be obliged to make grants to poorer deficitary countries, somewhere re-equilibrating that global logic. So far as capitalism is concerned, progressives didn't find it difficult to agree on the 8-hour day, rights for trade unionists, and a few other things like that. Maybe the universal suffrage. These were seen, and then welfare arrangements, as sort of checks on capitalism. Are there equivalents? In the case of imperialism, decolonization is something, but now that doesn't really quite apply any longer, but one could oppose all forms of foreign occupation and invasion. But are there other specifically economic mechanisms that would challenge imperialist logic and would remove some of the excesses of capitalism, or even put us in a situation where we would be better placed to challenge capitalism itself, because we would have gained some ground, as it were, in mitigating extremities and excesses?
Actually, Robin, could I just supplement your question to bring the initial question into focus? You ask about how we can imagine the interruption of the logic of capitalism. One way to think about the question of imperialism is, were we to imagine such a thing, would it actually affect adversely one set of countries more than others? That is to say, would it affect adversely countries that were traditionally described as imperialist and less than it would others? That would, I think, provide something of a criterion for what we are pursuing in this.
There's also a question from Pablo dos Santos and then Professor Nancy Fraser as well after that. Maybe we can take both questions together, or comments, as they may be.
I just wanted to follow up on something that Professors Blackburn and Foley mentioned and ask panelists to comment on this particular monetary expression of imperialism today, the US dollar's standing in the world economy as a reserve currency, something that of course has economic foundations in systems of settlements and also in the fact that most mobile capital originates in the dollar area and measures its progress in terms of dollars, but also has of course extra economic foundations. Because I absolutely agree that this dominance does affect a tribute from countries that are not reserve issuers to the Federal Reserve, to the US economy via the Federal Reserve. The most obvious expression, of course, is reserve holdings by central monetary authorities. But if you look at the balance sheet management of corporations in places like Mexico and Brazil right now, where they're integrated in terms of output markets, but as well as their liability side, they actually have to incur a number of expenditures and measures that are costly to those capitalist classes. So that's the one side. On the other side, of course, as Professor Foley mentioned, this issue of the fiscal space that the United States gets, the singular property. But before we get all Maoist on it, we should also realize that the most significant thing that this has allowed to develop in the US economy over the past period, of course, has been household debt to levels that no other economy could sustain. So I was just wondering if panelists could comment on some of these issues as aspects of market imperialism.
Well, first of all, this is a terrific discussion. It's very rich, very interesting, and the questions are just great. So I'm really happy that you've organized this. So I've always understood imperialism to be essentially a relation between economic power and political power, including military. And so I'd like to just ask you to think a little bit more. I'm very sympathetic to this idea of different epochs and social structures, and I would sort of think of imagining those social structures precisely as involving, at the very least, these two dimensions, the economic and the political. So I'd like to ask you to maybe help us think about this shift, and I do think there's some kind of a shift here, but I'm perfectly willing to use the term imperialism for the current and the immediately preceding epoch if we're clear about what we mean by it. So I mean, it seems to me that the shift of course, decolonization is very important, but what about the other important structural shifts in the organization of political power? That is the rise of various forms of transnational and global governance, the ways in which, of course, they're still dominated by powerful states. But there's some sort of a new organization of political power in which states are differently located. And of course, we have to talk about which states. And this is very much, it seems to me, tied up with regulation or non-regulation, or it's not just deregulation, but different forms of regulation of economic process, and therefore potentially different patterns in which value is siphoned from one part of the world to another. That's the complex of concepts that seem to me important here, and I'd like to hear more if any of you could.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, Professor Ghilarducci, please.
Thanks, Nancy and Paulo dos Santos. That just one other trend I was actually expecting to hear. I think I might be disagreeing with Anwar, I'm not sure. That I think the rise of monopoly capitalism is really important, because what's happened in the last 30 years is a very definite concentration among capitalists. Not only have the big banks gotten bigger and more powerful, some of the biggest corporations have actually extended their supply chains. And this has really accelerated because of hot money, and securitization has actually allowed the extent of the global firm much greater, even in the last 10 years. And so a panel on capitalism, we must talk about the changing form of the capitalists. And so I'm actually interested in going back to this idea of when monopolies really do get bigger and they combine with very large monopoly power in finance, what happens?
Any other questions or comments? I think we have maybe time for one more, and then we'll go back to the panelists who can give them each 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.
I have a question that's very different in character than every other question that's been asked. I'm a mathematician, so I've been enjoying this discussion very much, but I find it very hard to get my hands onto anything. And I was wondering, is there any, there's clearly a phenomenon of imperialism. I don't know what that phenomenon is, but it's clear that it exists. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this room having this very good discussion. Is there a nice formal model, simple, not that captures it, but is there a nice simple formal model of political economy which exhibits a phenomenon we would say, aha, this model, there's imperialism in here, this is not imperialism, but we see that there's something about imperialism that's captured in this?
I'm very glad I don't have to answer the last question. Perhaps we could proceed in the same order that the speaker spoke. If Professor Patnaik, please, 2 or 3 minutes each.
You know, there's not one model, but numerous models of imperialism that you can have. I mean, the imperialism, in fact, you know, Marx talked about the falling tendency of the rate of profit, and then he listed a whole lot of counteracting tendencies. Each of them has been built into a theory of imperialism. So you don't have one, but many, and you can model them. Okay, now let me just begin with the question which Akhil and Robin raised. You know, obviously there is no such thing as a hopeless situation for capitalism. Tomorrow, if something happens, if a part of the world in fact goes away from the capitalist orbit, it will still adjust to it. So the question of its collapsing is not what one is talking about. It may adjust in ways that undermine its legitimacy, but on the other hand, there is no such thing as a collapse. I also agree that you know, I mean, I would not think of, I mean, I see capitalism as a spontaneous system. Okay, I know Akhil doesn't like the word spontaneous, but you know, it's not a planned system. So it's not as if it does things because it's functionally useful and so on. It behaves in a certain way, it behaves in a certain spontaneous way. And from that point of view, I would say that even things like decolonization were not as it were thought out, planned strategies of something called capitalism which sat down around a table and decided. You know, Winston Churchill was totally opposed to decolonization of any kind. But the point is that, you know, that I think it's to do with the fact that at that time, I think the working classes had come out of the war much stronger. I think the Churchills of the world were on the retreat. And I think the Labour government and social democracy was on the rise in Western Europe. I think there was a very substantial challenge of communism. And you had a situation where the anti-colonial struggles were really kind of, you know, I mean, burgeoning. So in that kind of a situation, it had to make an adjustment. Now, I also therefore believe that there are these epochs in capitalism. And I think when Magdoff and so on wrote about imperialism, you actually had in the immediate post-decolonization phase, nation states trying to build something called the national economy against the hegemony of foreign capital, and it is this which actually brought imperialism into direct conflict. If you look at Mossadegh, if you look at, I mean, sometimes war, sometimes not war. If you look at Mossadegh, if you look at the entire struggle of the Nehruvian kind of, you know, ruling governments vis-a-vis the US, you know, and this is, therefore, imperialism was visible. And that's what Tom Weisskopf and or others may be talking about. Imperialism is a visible impediment to a strategy of national reconstruction. Now, I think today it's quite different because of changes in the structure of capital, because of the fact that we have now globalization of finance. We now, in fact, even have within the third world countries, the hiatus no longer between the country in question and the superpowers, but the hiatus runs within the country, between the bourgeoisie that is much more closely integrated with globalized finance and globalized capital, and the workers and peasants and so on. And so, really speaking, I agree with the epoch argument, but the question is, because the epoch is changed now, is there something in common that remains with that period? And I believe something in common does remain with that period, and that, among other things, is certainly the fact that, you know, there is this desire for raw materials, oil, and so on. And again, because it's not a planned system, there may be periods in which the same speculators push up oil prices, but we do know that the pushing up of the oil prices can have a very serious role as far as the economies are concerned. Just one last point about this US currency and so on. You know, I mean, it is true that it gives the US a certain leeway, but fundamentally, in the case of Britain, even though Britain was the leading country having deficit vis-a-vis all its rivals, it settled those deficits by having surpluses vis-a-vis the colonies. You know, but this is something which is not available to the US, and I think that marks a very major shift. So the leading capitalist country is also the leading indebted country.
I'm wondering whether this novel conjuncture contains progressive possibilities. I mean, we've seen in Europe it contains very strong regressive possibilities. I mean, do not underestimate what the terrible fate that's been inflicted on the Greek people has now been extended to the entire Eurozone. They're establishing a fiscal autocracy that will replace democratic governments with so-called technocrats. Technocrats who are often like Papademos in Greece. He was in charge of the central bank when the Greek government lied about its economic situation and its debt. He went along with that, and now he's the economic dictator of Greece, put in there by the so-called Troika. So there's this very negative possibility, but is there perhaps a progressive, a sort of Bretton Woods, if you like? Obviously, we've not been through anything like the Second World War, just even remotely, but there is a new social effervescence. There are struggles in Europe, there are struggles in China, there are struggles in North America. Would we have an idea of what shape to look for? I mean, would a new international currency, that's been suggested in some quarters, would that be a good idea? Richard Duncan has suggested that there should be a minimum raised wage in the export sector globally, you know, that we should strive for minimum living conditions, a sort of living wage, which many have campaigned for here just within the United States. How about a living wage globally, you know? Richard Duncan has a serious argument to that effect and points out it would help a whole tranche of capitalists who'd find new customers should it be put into operation. Just like the 8-hour day helped a lot of capitalists, the more efficient ones, who could still operate well under the restriction of an 8-hour day. Would something I've canvassed in New Left Review, would a global pension paid to all old people in the world of $1 a day, would that be a good idea? Again, it would revive demand, and if it was financed through a financial transaction tax or something that was a tax on capital, then it would be very redistributive. So just my final point is, really in a way, the imperialist aspects of capitalism are a great threat, but can't we turn them into a positive by coming up with progressive ideas of alternative organization, including at global level?
Thank you all very much. And my first comment is to my professor, Shaikh. I didn't need to go over what I learned in his class because I knew he would. So, but I remember everything. A few points. Chile, I want to make a comment. Duncan said, well, what about Chile? Allende was kind of a very committed, rhetoric aside, was committed to, I would call a left Keynesian, what you were just describing, a kind of wage-led growth model in a very aggressive way. That was what maybe he went too far in that. And the defeat of Allende, which was done through the CIA without a war, was an example of U.S. imperialism succeeding in defeating this possibility. And David Harvey from last year, in his book, Brief History of Neoliberalism, or whatever the exact title is, actually cites the Allende defeat and the replacement with the fascist government as actually the beginning of the era of neoliberalism. But I want to relate one anecdote about that, which is about 15 years after the overthrow of Allende, I actually was having dinner with the person who was finance minister under Allende. And I said, boy, you know, we really screwed you over, didn't we? The CIA said, yeah, you, and this guy was in jail, was in prison and tortured. So he was not like, you know, a soft socialist. And then he actually moved to East Germany afterwards. And he said, but you know what, we also screwed ourselves over. And this is what he said. He said, because we didn't think about overall macroeconomic management. And in particular, we didn't have any plan for inflation control. So that, yes, the CIA was fomenting hyperinflation, but no, the Allende government didn't have a plan. So they had a strong wage-led growth model that they were advancing, but it wasn't fully formed. So to Robin's question, I think that, you know, you listed out a lot of important things, and what I think the real alternative that we can struggle for now is a global wage-led model that would include reflation in the United States, Europe, and this, now it's a cliche, rebalancing with the China and India not running export surpluses but growing on the basis of wages rising in their own countries. And there is evidence, at least in China, very strong increases in wages going on now. I mean, in some sectors, wages are rising by 20 to 30%. If you don't believe me, I didn't believe this. I heard this recently and I got evidence, so it is true. Other areas would be, the one I mentioned at the end of my remarks, is around control of commodity prices. So decommodify commodity prices by having strong regulations. And this is one wherein you can actually form coalitions with liberal sectors of the bourgeoisie, including, in some cases, Ben Bernanke is absolutely adamant that he doesn't want the price of oil to keep spiking because that inhibits recovery. On the recovery, I want to say, I don't think that it's always the case that since the crisis began that there's been a deflationary bias. Quite the opposite. The fiscal stimulus policies were unprecedented historically in Europe and the United States. Now, they may not have been enough. They might not have been done correctly. I think that's true. Nevertheless, that was Keynesianism on steroids for a year and a half. Now, the question then is, okay, well, then why was there such a dramatic reversal and the rise of the austerity crowd gaining control? One would be that, well, they didn't want that. Another one would be that it did not succeed in achieving rapid enough growth so that you had a strong enough coalition in favor of it. However, in the United States still, I mean, we still have, we have a zero interest rate policy at the Fed. The trouble here is around regulation. I mean, the money is sitting at the banks. The U.S. commercial banks are sitting on $1 trillion of reserves. That's 10% of U.S. GDP. This is money they get for free. They just get it for free as much as they want. So we have ultra expansionary policies as regards the financial system. They can get all the money they want whenever they want it. The point is that we do not have what we could call a wage-led model that is going to move we don't have the premise of putting the money to create jobs and some semblance of social justice. So on a point of monopoly capital where you all are disagreeing, so of course I remember Anu's brilliant arguments on this point. I think that the point is not that you don't have big entities. They're big, but do they have monopoly pricing power? I think the answer there is no. I mean, they do have power. And as Anu said, you would expect, I mean, Goldman Sachs has a lot of power. Goldman Sachs and, J.P. Morgan have a lot of power, a lot more than all the, most of the governments of Europe combined in terms of determining economic outcomes. Would you call that monopoly power? I don't think in the sense that Anu, I don't think that would be monopoly power. Okay, so I'll end there. Thanks.
Let me take that. Thank you. I mean, there's so many issues here. I don't know how one can even begin to address them, but let me try to emphasize a point which I think is very relevant when you approach these issues from the point of view of the logic of profit activities rather than the logic of power. Now, profit activities are not separate from power, clearly. I mean, they're channeled through the state, and power plays a very important role, but they have a dynamic of their own. And one issue which comes up immediately is this idea of limits. In economics, there are debates about how far you can go before you hit these limits, but no economist I know argues that you can do nothing. Well, that's not true. They're not in our department, but almost all economists argue you can do nothing, but they're not in our department. And we all argue that you can and must do many things, but we also understand as economists that we have to understand the consequences of these things, and some of them can be terrible. Anybody who's worked with workers struggling for wages knows that you can push for a certain wage, but you push too far, and you're looking at a plant closed down because they move somewhere else, and that's something that you understand immediately when you make this struggle. So the issue then is, what are the limits? And clearly the first and primary limit is profit. So now comes a debate in economics. If you raise workers' wages, that's surely good for workers. Will that have a consequence in terms of job loss? A standard economist will say immediately and totally. We know that's a total lie. But we also know that if we're talking about wage-led growth, we're saying that there'll be increased demand, and that demand will get more profit, because firms don't care about how many things they sell. They care about what money they make from it, how much profit. But there is a contradiction there, because a wage is an increase in your cost. It's not just that you can sell more goods, you also get less per good, and that implies some kind of balance. And we always, on the left, talk about those balances. And I think that's important in these discussions of whether wage-led growth or profit-led growth is an issue. Everybody understands that both sides are there, and we're not sure exactly when the tipping point is, but they'll tell us if we go too far, so let's find out. Let's try. On the international scale, we understand that this channeling therefore means struggles about anti-poverty, anti-hunger, struggles on women's rights, workers' rights, civil rights, national wages. Many of these actions are already being taken up in countries like Brazil and Argentina and Ecuador. So we're not like we're imagining they will be done in the future. They're already happening because people, of course, have understood that point. I think if I understood Teresa correctly, and Bob actually said it for me, so I'll just say again very quickly, I don't think we need to confuse rising scale with monopoly power. And the central issue in the classical discussion is that rising scale is the means to beating your opponents, but it doesn't imply that you therefore are the only player in the game, because there are other big scales, and big scale leads to big scale. It may be international, it may be split-offs, but the history of these things is that they get bigger and they also get more intense. Literally, the struggle gets more intense, and that means that they have some influence, but their influence are within these limits of the influence of others of the same size. And that means I think we should abandon any notion of competition that we have had infected our minds from standard economic theory, because that's always been a fiction designed to celebrate capitalism, not to actually talk about how it works. The third point, which is the issue that Nancy raised, very important, I think, issue, and again, I don't know how we can talk about it in 30 seconds, but let me try. Clearly, capital is ahead of governance. That is, it is expanded at a world scale. We know that. We know that it is creating institutions in its own name, and these institutions haven't been named by us, but they will be as they're constructed, and perhaps that will lead to global governance, certainly global control of money, global control of mobility of capital, maybe mobility of labor, which is already there, controlled. And then it raises the issue that Nancy raised about value siphoning. And my answer here is that we have to distinguish between who and what when we come to value siphoning. It could be reasonably argued that the U.S. is a hegemonic power, but China is siphoning value from the U.S., right? Because that's one of the consequences of losing your competitive place. It's not, I don't think, a decision per se, but it's an outcome as a result of political decisions, which now is impossible to turn around. And that's one of the points about these paths. One last point. When we talk about the role of the U.S. dollar and the hegemonic role, the power that it gives, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's like you own a gold mine and you can just run that gold out. But the difference is that the U.S. dollar is not gold. You can always dump the dollar. And that means, and this is exactly what led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods. This is again an issue of limits. We had a huge amount of Eurodollars out there, and then the French started saying, well, thank you so much for your dollars, but we'd really like some gold. And they began, and others began to say, we want to get rid of the dollar. Nixon, quite sensibly and properly to protect the U.S. gold reserves, dumped the relation between the gold and the dollar. Now, why did he do that if gold is just a fiction? Why are the French looking for gold if it's a fiction? It's not a fiction. It's not about whether it's gold. It could be anything. The important thing is that you can get out of any currency. And there are times when you need to get out of any currency, and capitalism has established places for you to go, one of which is gold. And so people go. And it's not people like us who are holding large stores of gold. It's a capitalist class. So again, limits. Keep trying.